How serious is this? I mean, how much does it really set back the process? And frankly, what's it going to do to the timeline?
All big questions following news this week about problems with the expansion to the Colorado Convention Center. The city of Denver announced it's putting the project on hold and ending its contract with the company Trammell Crow. The company was managing the bidding process to hire a contractor for the $230 million expansion. Trammell Crow says a now former employee had improper communications with a bidder and was let go. The city has asked the district attorney's office to investigate.
9 News legal expert and Metro State University professor Whitney Traylor is here to talk more about it. Thanks for coming in.
Sure, good to be here.
So this kind of seemed to come out of nowhere. They fired this guy that they say was responsible for this communication problem, but are they still liable? Is there liability? What's going on?
Yeah, it's a good question, and not only did they fire him, but the statement that they released, they said, we had no idea, we're mortified, he or she, they didn't identify, had no authority to do that. And so the reason they did that is because there's what my students who just took their finals this week should know is the vicarious liability that the employee creates for the corporation. And so corporations themselves can also be sued and sue, and they can have liability, both civil and criminal, which is very much, I think, a possibility in this situation.
Like it,
So the city asked the Denver DA to now get involved in this. What crimes have been committed and what happens from there?
Well, I think they want the Denver DA, the investigative aspect, to look into the bidding process. And so Mayor Hancock also said that he's looking at modifying the legislation, and there's legislation called debarment, which would essentially prevent Mortensen or Trammell Crow or whoever else from being able to bid on future projects for a certain time period. It could be permanently. But there could be also, I mean, there's general liability for this kind of fraud, but there's also, it could be a Sherman Act, an antitrust violation, depending on who's involved, and that has $100 million criminal penalties for the corporation and $1 million for the individuals and up to 10 years in prison. So there could be really significant crimes. And it also brings into issue previous awards that were given. It appears that it was Mortensen, that's what the papers are leaning towards, that was the company that got the improper information. Well, Mortensen has recently gotten several bids with the city. I'm not saying that those were improper, but I think it would inevitably bring those into question. You'd have to look back at the process and see, you know, have these other contracts been improper?
Yeah, so the city attorney's office has been looking into this for a while, and then they have referred it now to the district attorney.
Yep.
So they must have felt that there's some sort of criminal activity going on.
That's exactly right. And the city's also saying that they didn't know anything about it, which, you know, could be the case because Trammell Crow was the project manager. So the city basically, and they were paying them $9 million. So the city said, look, you handle getting these general contractors and things like that. And it was Trammell Crow that apparently leaked the information, and it apparently went to Mortensen. So yeah, there could be other terminations. The city, we're looking at new legislation. I think the city's going to have to look back at some of the other contracts, and I'm sure imagine if you bid on one of those previous contracts and say Mortensen got it, you would, I'm sure, feel like, hey, I missed out on a $20 million contract that may have been improper.
I really lost out on that. I mean, obviously there's legislation against this, but how common do you think this is?
Well, it's not uncommon for these kind of bribes to go on in various levels of government, but you haven't heard about a lot of these specifically in Denver. And recently with the amount of construction, I mean, there's been plenty of opportunity. I'm not saying that these things don't happen regularly, but they certainly aren't discovered regularly. So, you know, and if the legislation changes, then the whole process can be much more rigorous, and you would see less of this in the future.
Yeah, at the very least, they got to go back to step one now in bidding, right? That's
correct, yeah, and that's part of, I think the DA may head up that process in terms of how we're going to revamp and start the RFPs again.
And that really affects the community in terms of now we're putting everything on hold again before the expansion can start, and we're kind of starting over.
Totally, and you know, from a broader perspective, you know, you hear all these folks talking about government intervention and let us do business. Man, this completely illuminates the reason why government has to get involved, right? This is a white collar crime. Somebody just doesn't follow the process, decides to get greedy, and now we have all branches of government. We're going to have legislation, the mayor's involved, so the executive. We're going to have judges who are going to be imposing these sentences, right? I mean, this costs millions of dollars to prosecute these types of white collar crimes, and people don't view them quite the same way as sort of your everyday crimes,
right.
but they should.
Very similar.
Big money and waste of time and the whole deal.
Right.
Whitney Traylor, as always, thank you for your input.
Sure, good to be here.
Appreciate it.
All right.